Chapter 26, The Wildwood Irregulars, a name to conjure with. At the Fox's instruction, Curtis, along with the archers and riflemen, after scrambling to the top of the ridge, held their positions behind the charging unit at the higher ground above the bowl of the clearing. He watched as the rest of the irregulars tore into the heated melee below. A black bear wielding a threshing flail was laying into the tide of coyotes with a surprising enthusiasm, a wide swale of unconscious coyotes littering his wake. A bandit, armed with two short sabers, was engaging in a fierce skirmish with a coyote swordsman. The coyote seemed to be getting the better of the bandit, until Curtis saw a rabbit, his haunches covered in blue denim, snaking between the feet of the coyote, stretching a tangled web of twine. Before the coyote had any idea what was happening, the twine cinched at his ankles and he went crashing down to the earth in a mid-sword thrust. The figure of the dowager governess, astride her horse, towering over the warring hordes, and she laid an impressive swath of destruction wherever she leapt her horse. Bandits and farmers fell at the flashing steel of her longsword. Every attempt to unhorse her seemed to fail. Her skill at swordplay was clearly unparalleled in this field of battle. Curtis watched her with rapt fascination as she made her way through the crowd, her eyes set on the far staircase that would lead to the third tier, the clearing where the plinth lay. A barked instruction woke him from his spellbound stare. Samuel the Hare stood at the end of the line of soldiers on the ridge and made his command. "Long-range fighters, ready your weapons!" Curtis dropped a large stone into the cradle of his sling. A loud whistle emanated from the midst of the combat below. It appeared to come from Alexandra, her fingers poised between her lips. Within an instant, a deafening sound of screeching tore through the air, and the silver of the sky to the east of the clearing was blotted by a throng of jet-black birds. "The crows," Curtis whispered to himself in awe. Samuel seemed to be in the grip of the sight as well. The scores of these flying birds like spatterings of ink against the tree line as they dove down into the skirmishers below, but finally returned his attention to the charge. "Fire!" he shouted. The ridge came alive with the crack of gunfire and the swish of arrows. Curtis let fly the rock from his sling and watched it arc lazily towards his intended target. He was dismayed to see it fall well short of its mark, lost in the ocean of ivy that carpeted the ground of the clearing. A bandit standing next to him, repacking the barrel of his musket, saw the shot. "Swing harder," he suggested. "Put more arm into it." "Yeah, okay," Curtis said as he grabbed another rock from his pocket. A few crows had fallen during this barrage, but more arrived to take the place of their fallen kin. A dark cloud of birds funneled up the wide valley from the first tier. The clearing was awash in the noise of clanging steel and the warlike shouts of the combatants. Prue watched briefly as the Fox's battalion made their charge over the ridge into the wide valley below, before she turned and ran back to her station, at the little stand of trees that stood between the middle and upper tiers. The valley in which the ruins sat was masked by the hill of ivy and trees, and as she ran back up the ridge, she had to roughly gauge where her initial position had been. Guessing at a break in the trees, she dove through the underbrush at the crest of the ridge, and, losing her footing, tumbled down the hillside, her fall softened by the rich bed of ivy. Standing up to brush herself off, she saw the plinth standing in the center of a clearing, its fluted base covered by fresh shoots of ivy vines. She began to walk towards it. She wanted to touch it, to feel the cold, austere stone, but was reminded of Brendan's instructions when the sound of thousands of screeching crows beyond the wall of the trees issued forth. She ran to her previous position, behind a squat stand of salmonberry bushes, and looked down at the heated battle below. She watched, aghast, as the teeming murder upon murder of black crows that wheeled over the clearing. Brendan, flanked by two bandits, stood on the bottom step of the wide stone flight of stairs that led up the slope to the top tier. The three bandits were in a bitter struggle with an ever-growing crowd of coyote swordsmen. Brendan and the bandit on his right stood with their sabers flying, desperately holding the coyotes at bay, while the bandit on his left busily crammed ammunition into the muzzle of his rifle. While Prue watched, Brendan gave a swift kick to the chest of one coyote assaulter, while shoving another away with the flat of his saber blade. Given a moment's respite, he glanced back to see Prue ducking her head out from behind the covert. "Good job!" he cried, leaping backward, step by step, up the flight of stairs. "Now quick! Get to Cormac's unit! I want them to come down the ridge, regroup in the lower tier, and sweep up the slope from the east. Catch them in the rear flank. Is that clear? Got it, she said, preparing to run. Brendan wiped a streak of blood from his brow. His beard was clumped with perspiration. If we can hold them a little longer, he said, eyeing the field of battle, I can maybe get the Dowager, but I need those reinforcements to set up the distraction. Prue dove off into the brush. The ivy was impossibly dense here, in the space between the middle and upper tiers, and Prue's sprint was hampered by the vines, but she made it to the far ridge in a matter of minutes. Before she knew it, she was tearing down the lee side of the ridge, the low-hanging tree branches lashing at her face and hands. Farther down the slope, the 3rd unit of the Wildwood Irregulars lay in wait. What's happening? Are we to attack? Asked Cormac, frantically, when Prue came to a sliding stop amid the waiting bandits and farmers. His was the last unit to receive instructions, and Prue could tell he was desperate to join the fray. The sounds emanating from the valley beyond the little ridge came loud and fierce. He wants you to head down the ridge line, she said, battling for breath. Regroup in the lower clearing, and then come up from behind. Cormac looked at her blankly. How do we know we won't be surrounded once we're there? Does he know how many soldiers remain in the lower tier? Prue raised her hands apologetically. She could read the fear on the bandit's face. That's what he said to do. He seems to have a plan. Very well, said Cormac gravely, turning to the gathering soldiers under his command. Down the ridge, lads. We're to fall in front of the rear. In from the rear. Ducking low, the 3rd unit irregulars jogged down the line of the ridge, while the sounds of battle receded behind them. When they'd traveled far enough, Cormac instructed them to hold tight while he crawled up to the top of the ridge and looked over the lip. Prue waited with the rest of the unit, hearing their quiet, steady breathing and the sound of their weapons, iron, wood, and stone, as they turned them over, antsy, in their hands and paws. Cormac returned from the ridge. His face was pale and serious. There's a whole army down there, he said stonily, waiting to funnel up those stairs to the 2nd tier. He looked over at Prue. It's an impossible feat. What do you want me to do? Prue asked, searching the bandit's worn face for an answer. Nothing, said Cormac finally, shaking his head. Tell the king we done what he told us. Tell him there are 400 more in the lower clearing. There's a line of heavy artillery, I'd say 12 cannons, just about up the slope. They'll need to contend with that. As for us, we'll do our best. Turning back to the gathering soldiers, Cormac gave his orders. Over the top, lads, he said, and with a great yell, the 3rd unit of irregulars crested the top of the ridge and ran howling down the far side. Prue remained in the protection of the lower ridge for a time, listening to the cries of the soldiers and the loud baying of the coyote army they engaged, before she took a deep breath and went running back through the bracken, up the line of the ridge. Arriving back at the stone steps above the middle clearing, Prue was surprised to see that Brendan had left his prior position on the stairs. Momentarily panicked that he'd been struck down, she crouched low and crawled to the head of the steps and looked out over the tumult of warring armies in the wide square. She could see Alexandra in the center of the crowded melee, her sword making wide arcs over the heads of her embattled soldiers. Mac's face, flushed and distorted in a terrifying fit of crying, peered out from the horse's saddlebag. A tight ring of protective coyote grunts had made a circle around Alexandra as she slowly attempted to wade her way through the crowd. Occasionally, a squadron of crows would dive-bomb into the chaotic multitude and return to the air, a farmer's pitchfork or a bandit's saber clutched in their talons. Suddenly, Prue caught sight of Brendan's crown of vines in the midst of the crowd. He'd forced his way closer to Alexandra and her guard of soldiers. "Brendan!" Prue shouted. It was impossible to raise her voice above the deafening clamor of the battle. "Brendan!" she hollered again. She saw him hesitate in his violent slog through the crowd. He searched the air for the source of the voice. She stood up and waved her arms in the air. "Cannons!" she shouted, pointing to the place where the ground sloped away towards the first clearing. "They're moving in cannons!" He furrowed his brow, confused. She pointed again to the far slope, this time with as much animation as she could muster. He looked where she pointed, in time to see the great black muzzles of the dozen cannons crest the ridge. His face dropped. Curtis was the first to see the cannons, their 4 coyote artillery teams laboring to push the massive guns up the slope of the hill. There must have been more than 10 of them, all lined up along the lip of the clearing, and he was disturbed to see the artillery crews, once they'd set the cannons in position, swivel them to point at the line of archers and fusiliers who manned the ridge he currently stood on. "Samuel!" he screamed, not taking his eyes from the line of cannons. "What?" called Samuel, his musket raised to his eye as he took aim at the crowd in the middle of the clearing. "Cannons!" said Curtis, pointing to the artillery. Samuel dropped his musket to his side and stared. He gulped. "Hold your line, boys." "Are you kidding me?" asked Curtis. "Hold the line," repeated Samuel, as he hefted the musket back to his shoulder, this time aiming at the artillery teams as they began to load the cannons. "Let's see if we can't take some of them out before they get a shot." The line of archers and fusiliers turned and aimed into the row of coyote artillery and fired, the ridge exploding with gun smoke and rifle fire. Curtis looked to see several coyote artillery officers fall, only to be replaced by reinforcements from the slope behind them. While the irregulars reloaded, shoving muskets full of powder or pulling arrows from their quivers, the coyote artillery completed their task and let fire the cannons. The world erupted around Curtis. The explosion instantly silenced the noise of the warring armies, and Curtis's hearing was reduced to a single high-pitched whine. The ground beneath his feet seemed to fall away, and he was showered in a wild spray of earth as he fell back, tumbling into a seemingly endless, bottomless void. Prue screamed to see the cannon fire rip into the ridge of archers and riflemen, knowing that Curtis had been positioned there. The ridge had practically disintegrated under the awesome power of the artillery, leaving a wide slope of craters where the leafy hillside had once been. The displaced soil from the barrage rained down on the warring armies in the square. What was left of the ridge was empty of its prior occupants. In the middle of the tumultuous crowd of fighters, Prue saw Brendan, his saber swinging in a wild circle around his head. Having witnessed the dizzying spectacle and the devastation that the line of cannon had wrought, he gave a long, defiant whoop before diving back into battle. As the coyote artillery team prepped their guns for another fusillade, a fresh wave of coyote infantry came roaring up the slope from the lower tier. Prue watched in despair, understanding the implications of this new assault, that Cormac's unit had been unable to hold back the reinforcements. Like a basin overfilled with water, the bowl of the clearing could not contain the amount of bodies it was now carrying, and the fight was forced up onto the adjacent hillsides as the vastly dominant coyote army began their systematic routing of the Wildwood irregulars. Curtis emerged from unconsciousness to the thunderous sound of a million pounding footsteps all around his ears. His hearing was still impaired. The world sounded as if it were veiled in a thick fog. He was half buried in earth, and as he took in his surroundings, he realized that he had awoken some 20 feet away from where he'd initially lost consciousness. The footsteps, he quickly gauged, were of the conjoined forces of the coyotes and the irregular infantry, the fighting having been forced over the cannonball-cratered ridge. Curtis, gaining his bearings, covered his head with his arm in an effort to avoid being trampled. Protecting himself thus, he began crawling away from the throng of fighters, toward a little thicket of plum trees. He'd no sooner arrived in the safety of the trees than he heard a click behind him, the distinctive noise of a pistol's hammer being engaged. He turned slowly, still on his hands and knees, to see a coyote sergeant, his uniform stained with dirt and blood, standing over him, his pistol cocked and at the ready. "Hello there, turncoat," said the coyote, immediately recognizing Curtis from his time in the warren. "This is a pleasant surprise." He grinned, his face carved from jowl to jowl by a string of long yellow teeth. He held the pistol jauntily in his paw, prolonging the moment. I'm going to enjoy this very much." He paused and scratched his snout with the muzzle of the gun. "Might be a promotion in it for me. I'll be decorated a war hero. Sergi, Turncoat Slayer, that's what they'll call me." "Please," said Curtis, backing up against the trunk of a tree. "Let's talk this through. You don't need to do this." "Oh, but I do," corrected the sergeant. "I really, really do." He held the pistol at arm's length, carefully taking aim at Curtis. Curtis squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the shot. Plunk. The noise came subtly, and Curtis quickly opened his eyes. Another plunk. The coyote, his pistol still outstretched, was being assaulted from above by plums. "What the devil?" shouted the coyote, searching the branches of the plum tree. The snout of a rat appeared from behind a curtain of yellow leaves. "Hey, mutt!" cried the rat. Curtis saw that it was Septimus. "Up here!" The coyote, enraged, had lifted the pistol and was beginning to take aim at Septimus when Curtis spied his chance. He leapt from the ground and bowled into the coyote sergeant with all the force he could muster. His head connected with the coyote's belly, and Curtis could feel it deflate like a balloon, the air escaping through the coyote's mouth with a loud oof. The coyote crumpled at the force, and the two of them went tumbling to the ground. Curtis reached for the pistol, and the coyote, regaining his senses, struggled to keep the gun from his attacker. Finally, in the chaos, Curtis was able to get his hands cupped over the coyote's grip on the pistol handle and began trying to wrest it away. The coyote began kicking his hind paws into Curtis's stomach, and he could feel the claws scratching painful scores across the skin under his uniform. The coyote, above him now, yelped in frustration as he tried to regain control of the gun. Curtis pulled it towards him, the cool metal of the barrel pressed up against his cheek. Bang! Curtis flinched. Had the pistol gone off in his hand? Had he been shot? The coyote's strong grip on the pistol loosened, and his paws fell away. Curtis saw that his eyes had rolled back in his head, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth like a fat slug. The coyote collapsed lifeless on top of Curtis. Shoving the sergeant's body aside, Curtis jumped up and looked around him. He was surprised to see Ashlyn standing not far off, a little wisp of smoke drifting up from the muzzle of her pistol. She wore a shocked look on her face. I hadn't used it yet." A whistle sounded from the plum tree boughs. "And not a moment too soon," complimented Septimus. Curtis, sympathetic to the girl's shock, walked over to her and took her hand. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what would have happened." Ashlyn forced a smile. "Well, there you go," she said. "Good thing you gave me this." The clamor of the fighting behind them arrested them from their conversation, and they each gave one another a final fleeting look before Curtis ran back into battle. Ashlyn remained motionless in the grove, looking down at the pistol in her hand. The tide had clearly turned for the worst. Prue stood on top of the stairs of the ancient steps, staring out over the clearing as the coyote reinforcements poured in from the far side. She'd seen a small wave of Cormac's unit appear at the lip of the slope, being pressed backwards by the crush of coyote soldiers. Before long, they were forced into the middle tier and were reunited with Brendan's unit, though both troops had been badly diminished. The Wildwood irregulars appeared to be hopelessly separated, with the conjoined soldiers of Brendan's and Cormac's units surrounded in the bowl of the middle tier, and the remnants of Sterling's troop having been chased over the edge of the southern ridge. The governess, seizing her moment, began careening her horse across the sea of bodies towards the steps that led to the upper clearing. Brendan saw her move and yelled something at the few bandits who fought at his side. They, together, began fighting their way towards Alexandra's intended path. Prue didn't see how it happened. The action in the clearing was much too fast and chaotic to see clearly. But in the few seconds between Brendan's sighting of Alexandra and his arrival at the spot in front of her horse, a shot had been fired from somewhere far off. Prue couldn't tell if it had been a coyote sharpshooter, lodged in a tree somewhere, or perhaps a misfire from a fellow irregular, but its object was clear. Brendan's head flew back in an agonizing yell, and he fell away from the charging horse, a bright splash of red suddenly appearing on the shoulder of his white shirt. Seeing the bandit king struck low, the surrounding soldiers, human and coyote alike, paused in their fighting to watch him stumble backward and fall to the ground. The bandits howled in anger and despair, but no sooner were they able to bear witness to the king's wounds than a fresh wave of coyote soldiers fell on them, and they leapt with a renewed ferocity back into battle. Brendan, abandoned, lay in the trampled ivy vines of the clearing floor, his fingers clutching at his shoulders. "No!" shouted Prue. and without thinking, she dove down the marble steps into the horde of battling soldiers. In the frenzy of battle, she was able to slip through relatively unnoticed. One coyote grunt, having dispatched his opponent, spotted her as she made her way toward Brendan, and dove to intercept her. He was stopped short by one of the irregulars, a stoat in coveralls, who swung the iron blade of a shovel in front of him, and the two fell into fierce combat. Another coyote turned to see her as she crawled between the backs of two battling soldiers, and aimed the long barrel of his rifle at her. An arrow thunked into his chest, and he fell, yelping, to the ground. Brendan was crawling helplessly across the ivy-strewn stone of the clearing when Prue finally arrived at his side. He'd made little distance. The green leaves of the ivy were splattered with his blood, making a dotted trail of crimson red behind him. "Brendan!" she shouted, grasping for his arm. He turned his face to her. His eyes were glassy, and his beard was matted with dirt, sweat, and blood. His white shirt was now soaked red, and his pale coloring was slowly disappearing from the skin of his face. "Outsider," he croaked, his cracked lips forced apart in a wry smile. "Sweet girl." He glanced over at the wound on his shoulder and spat angrily on the ground. 15 generations of bandits," he said. 15 kings. And I'm felled by a cursed gunshot. He looked back at Prue. "I don't want to die," he said, his face soft and quieted. "I want to keep here. Help me to keep here." Prue, her face streaming with tears, tore her hoodie off and packed the cotton fabric against the flow of blood in his shoulder. The green of the hoodie turned brown as the cloth became soaked in the blood. "You'll be okay," said Prue. "We've just got to stop the bleeding." Desperately scanning the clash of the battle behind them, Prue searched the crowd for another bandit who might be able to help. Her first aid knowledge was woefully little. "Help!" she cried. "The king! He's been shot!" Suddenly, a long shadow fell over Prue and the prone form of the bandit king. Prue squinted upward to see Alexandra, steeple-tall in the saddle of her black stallion, as the horse reared dramatically, his forelegs sending up a spray of earth. Her sword was drawn, and she held it above her head, the blade wet with blood. The baby in her saddlebag wailed. "Your time is over, Bandit King," she said. "A new era in Wildwood has begun." Without a further word, she spurred the flanks of her horse and vaulted over the top of the two of them, Prue and Brendan, in a single leap, galloping towards the unguarded marble stairs that led to the ruined upper tier.